She had nothing left but a lame horse worth less than the rope around its neck, and a debt that would bury her family's name forever, until a Half-Apache stranger with silver coins and storm-gray eyes paid what she owed and claimed something far more valuable than money. The morning sun beat down on Willow Creek like a punishment from God himself, turning the main street into a ribbon of dust and broken dreams. Sarah Beth McKenna walked that street with her head held high despite everything, despite the whispers that followed her like shadows, despite the weight of shame pressing down on her shoulders, despite the knowledge that this might be the last time she'd walk through town as a free woman.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Behind her, limping with each painful step, came the last remnant of everything her family had ever built. Dusty was a paint horse, once proud and strong, now reduced to favoring his left front leg, where a rattlesnake bite had left him permanently lamed. The horse's coat, once gleaming chestnut and white, had dulled to the color of old pennies, and his ribs showed through skin that hung loose over a frame that had seen too many missed meals. Sarah Beth's own appearance wasn't much better. Her dress, once a cheerful blue calico, had faded to the color of winter sky, and bore patches at the elbows and hem, where careful mending couldn't quite hide the wear. Her boots, her father's boots, really, cut down and stuffed with newspaper. To fit her smaller feet were cracked leather held together by determination and prayer. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun that couldn't quite contain the rebellious curls that had always marked her as Thomas McKenna's daughter. In her right hand, she clutched a piece of paper that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Over the past 3 months, the edges were worn soft from handling and the ink had begun to fade, but every word remained burned into her memory. It was a promissory note, signed in her father's careful handwriting, acknowledging a debt of $800 to Silas Cartwright, with interest compounding monthly at 15%. At the bottom, in Thomas McKenna's steady script, were the words that had haunted Sarah Beth's dreams. Collateral, McKenna Homestead, livestock and all holdings, $800. It might as well have been 8,000 or 8 million. Sarah Beth had exactly $12.37 to her name, earned from selling her mother's wedding china piece by piece over the past month. Even if she could find working jobs for unmarried women in Willow Creek were scarcer than honest politicians, she'd need years to earn that kind of money. And the note was due today. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was walking toward the very man who held her future in his soft, pale hands. Silas Cartwright owned half of Willow Creek and had his eyes on the other half. He'd been circling the McKenna homestead like a vulture ever since her father's death 2 months ago, making increasingly generous offers to help the poor girl in her time of need. Each offer had come with conditions that made Sarah Beth's skin crawl, and each refusal had made Cartwright's smile grow thinner and more dangerous. Now she was out of refusals, out of time, and nearly out of hope. The Cartwright Bank and Land Office sat on the corner of Main Street and Prosperity Avenue like a fat spider in the center of its web. Built of imported brick and crowned with a pretentious clock tower, it was the finest building in 3 counties, and never let anyone forget it. Cartwright had spared no expense in announcing his importance to the world, from the brass nameplate on his mahogany desk to the oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who'd probably never set foot west of the Mississippi. Sarah Beth paused at the bottom of the marble steps, gathering what remained of her courage. Through the tall windows she could see Cartwright at his desk, his round face split by a smile that had all the warmth of a January morning. He'd been waiting for this moment, she realized. Probably had been since the day he'd agreed to loan her father the money for that damned mining venture that had cost Thomas McKenna his life and his daughter's future. The bell above the door chimed like a funeral dirge as Sarah Beth stepped inside, leading Dusty behind her. The horse's hooves clicked against the polished wooden floor, and she saw Cartwright's clerk look up in alarm at the sight of livestock in the sacred halls of finance. "Miss McKenna," Cartwright said, rising from his desk with exaggerated courtesy. "How punctual of you. Though I must say, bringing your horse inside seems a bit irregular." Sarah Beth's chin lifted another degree. "Dusty goes where I go, Mr. Cartwright. He's all the family I have left." Cartwright's eyes traveled over the lame horse with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. "Yes, I can see the sentimental value. Though I'm afraid sentiment doesn't settle debts, does it?" He gestured toward the chair in front of his desk, but Sarah Beth remained standing. She knew that once she sat down, she'd be admitting defeat, accepting the role of supplicant that Cartwright wanted her to play. "I have a proposition," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Give me 6 months. I'll work double shifts at the hotel, take in washing, do whatever it takes. I'll pay you back every penny with interest." Cartwright's laugh was like the sound of coins dropping into a collection plate. "My dear girl, we've been through this before. The note was due today. Not next week, not next month. Today." He opened the leather portfolio and withdrew the promissory note, holding it up like a death warrant. "Your father signed this document in my presence, witnessed by my clerk and the sheriff. It's quite legally binding." Sarah Beth's hands clenched into fists. "My father was desperate. His mining partner had just been killed in a cave-in, and he needed money to extract the equipment before the claim was seized. You knew he was in no condition to make a rational decision. Your father was a grown man who made a business arrangement. The fact that his mining venture proved unsuccessful doesn't invalidate his obligations." Cartwright's tone carried the false sympathy of a snake oil salesman. "However, I'm not an unreasonable man. I'm prepared to make you the same offer I've extended before." Sarah Beth's stomach churned, but she forced herself to ask, "Which is?" "Marriage, of course. A union between our families would solve all your financial difficulties and provide you with the security and protection a young woman needs in these uncertain times." Cartwright's smile widened, revealing teeth like yellowed piano keys. "I'm quite willing to forgive the debt entirely as a wedding gift to my bride." The words hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, choking and bitter. Sarah Beth had known this moment would come, had steeled herself for it during the long sleepless nights since her father's funeral. But hearing the proposal spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Cartwright's expression hardened. "Then I'll have no choice but to foreclose on the property. The homestead, the barn, the 40 acres your family has worked for 15 years, all of it will be seized to satisfy the debt. You'll have until sunset to vacate the premises." Sarah Beth felt the world tilt around her. The homestead wasn't just her home. It was where her parents were buried, where she'd taken her first steps, where her father had taught her to ride and shoot and survive in a land that didn't much care whether women lived or died. It was the last tangible connection to a family that had been carved down to just one member, standing alone in a banker's office with nothing but a lame horse and fading hope. "I need time to think," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Of course, take all the time you need." Cartwright consulted his gold pocket watch with theatrical precision. "You have until 4 o'clock this afternoon to make your decision. That's when the sheriff arrives to serve the foreclosure papers." Sarah Beth turned toward the door, then stopped. "Mr. Cartwright, may I ask you something?" "Certainly, my dear." "Did you know? When you loaned my father that money, did you know the Copper Ridge claim was already played out?" Cartwright's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his pale eyes. "I'm a banker, Miss McKenna, not a mining engineer. I evaluated the collateral, not the business venture." It wasn't an answer, but it was answer enough.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Sarah Beth had suspected as much, that Cartwright had known exactly what he was doing when he'd offered her grieving, desperate father what seemed like salvation. He'd been planning this moment from the beginning, orchestrating her family's downfall with the patience of a man who'd built his fortune on other people's misery. "Good day, Mr. Cartwright," she said, her voice steady as mountain stone. "Until 4 o'clock, Miss McKenna. I do hope you'll make the wise choice." The bell chimed again as Sarah Beth led Dusty back onto the street, but the sound might as well have been a death knell. 4 hours. She had 4 hours to find $800 or surrender everything her family had built to a man whose idea of courtship involved financial coercion. The main street of Willow Creek stretched before her like a gauntlet of judgment. Every face that turned her way seemed to carry the same expression, pity mixed with relief that it was her misfortune and not their own. Mrs. Patterson from the general store actually crossed the street to avoid her, as if poverty might be contagious. Old Doc Henley tipped his hat, but couldn't quite meet her eyes. Only one person approached her directly. Jack Morrison, who ran the livery stable, stepped out from under the shade of his barn's overhang and walked toward her with the careful gait of a man delivering bad news. "Sarah Beth," he said, his voice gentle, "I heard about your situation." She stopped, grateful for a friendly face, but wary of another false offer of help. "News travels fast in a small town." "It does." Morrison glanced at Dusty, taking in the horse's condition with the expert eye of a man who'd spent his life around horses. "I won't insult you by pretending I can solve your problems, but I wanted you to know if you need a place for Dusty, I'll stable him free of charge. For as long as necessary." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her composure. Sarah Beth blinked hard against the tears that threatened to spill. "That's generous of you, Jack, but I can't accept charity. It's not charity. It's neighbors helping." "Neighbors? Your daddy helped me plenty of times when I was starting out." Morrison's weathered face creased with genuine concern. "Besides, that horse has been through enough. Whatever happens this afternoon, Dusty deserves a warm stall and regular meals." Sarah Beth looked down at her horse, seeing him through Morrison's eyes. Dusty's ribs were showing, his coat had lost its luster, and the limp seemed more pronounced than usual. She'd been so focused on their shared predicament that she'd failed to notice how much her own struggles had affected him. "You're right," she said quietly. "He deserves better than what I can give him right now." Morrison nodded toward his stable. "Bring him over. I'll get him settled and fed. You go do whatever you need to do." Leading Dusty across the street felt like walking to a gallows. The horse seemed to sense something was happening, his ears pricked forward and his steps more tentative than usual. Sarah Beth had rescued him as a colt after his mother died in a flash flood, bottle feeding him and nursing him through a dozen illnesses and injuries. He'd been her constant companion through her father's illness and death, the one living thing that had never questioned her decisions or demanded more than she could give. Now she was abandoning him, just as surely as if she'd turned him loose. In the desert, Morrison's stable was clean and well-maintained, with a dozen stalls and the kind of attention to detail that spoke of genuine care for the animals in his charge. He led Dusty to a corner stall that was larger than the others, with fresh hay and a water trough that had been recently filled. "He'll be safe here," Morrison said, running a practiced hand on Dusty's neck. "That leg been bothering him long?" "Since April. Rattlesnake got him while we were checking fence line. The bite healed, but something got damaged inside." That said, there wasn't much to be done. Sarah Beth's voice caught. "Daddy was already sick by then, so we just made do." Morrison nodded, understanding the whole story in those few words. A lame horse was often a dead horse on the frontier, where only the strong and useful survived. The fact that Sarah Beth had kept Dusty alive and fed through everything else spoke to either deep loyalty or dangerous sentimentality. "He's got good bones," Morrison said diplomatically. "Sometimes these things heal better than we expect, given time and proper care." Sarah Beth wanted to believe him, but hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. She stroked Dusty's muzzle one last time, memorizing the feel of his whiskers against her palm and the warm breath on her fingers. "Be good," she whispered. "I'll come back for you if I can." The horse whickered softly, as if he understood. Sarah Beth turned away quickly, before her resolve could crumble entirely. Back on the street, the afternoon sun seemed harsher than before. She checked her father's pocket watch, the one piece of his belongings she hadn't been able to bring herself to sell, and saw that it was nearly 2 o'clock. 2 hours until her world collapsed entirely. She considered her options with the methodical desperation of a condemned woman. She could throw herself on the mercy of the church, but Reverend Williams was Cartwright's brother-in-law and unlikely to interfere with family business. She could try to find work in one of the neighboring towns, but that would mean abandoning the homestead anyway. She could attempt to flee, but where would she go with no money, no horse, and no connections? Beyond Willow Creek? Or she could accept Cartwright's proposal and spend the rest of her life as the wife of a man who'd orchestrated her family's destruction for the privilege of owning her. The thought made her physically sick. She'd rather face whatever lay beyond the town's borders with nothing but the clothes on her back than wake up every morning next to Silas Cartwright's satisfied smile. That left one option, a miracle. And Sarah Beth McKenna had never been the type to count on divine intervention. She was walking aimlessly toward the edge of town, lost in dark thoughts, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the north. Not the plodding rhythm of a farm horse or the crisp clip-clop of a buggy team, but something different. Something that spoke of distances traveled and trails conquered. Sarah Beth looked up to see a rider emerging from the heat haze that hung over the desert road. Even at a distance, there was something about him that commanded attention. He sat, his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, and his mount a magnificent black stallion, moved with the fluid power of an animal that had never known want or neglect. As they drew closer, Sarah Beth could make out more details. The rider was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered confidence that came from surviving in places where weakness meant death. His skin was the deep bronze of mixed heritage, and his hair was black as midnight, tied back with a strip of leather. He wore a mix of white man's clothing and Apache traditional dress denim pants and a cotton shirt, but also beaded moccasins and a medicine bag hanging from his neck. Most striking of all were his eyes. Even from 20 yards away, Sarah Beth could see they were the color of storm clouds, gray and silver and full of depths she couldn't fathom. The rider's gaze swept the street, taking in the buildings, the people, the general atmosphere of a town going about its daily business. When his eyes met Sarah Beth's, something passed between them, a moment of recognition that had nothing to do with having met before and everything to do with understanding. He reined in his horse a few feet away, and Sarah Beth caught the scent of leather and sage, and something wild that belonged to open spaces and endless skies. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and quiet, with the faint accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language. "You look like someone carrying heavy thoughts." Sarah Beth blinked, startled by the directness of his observation. "I'm sorry? Heavy thoughts," he repeated. "The kind that weigh down the shoulders and make the world seem smaller than it is." She studied his face, searching for mockery or false sympathy, but found only genuine concern. It was such an unexpected kindness from a complete stranger that she felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "It's nothing a stranger would want to hear about," she said, attempting a smile that felt like a grimace. The rider dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground without a sound. Up close, he was even more imposing, well over 6 feet tall, with the kind of presence that seemed to fill the space around him. But there was nothing threatening in his manner, only a calm attentiveness that invited confidence. "Try me," he said simply, and to her own amazement, Sarah Beth found herself telling him everything. The debt, the foreclosure, the impossible choice. Between marriage to Cartwright and losing everything her family had built. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, carrying with them all the fear and anger and desperate hope she'd been holding inside. The stranger listened without interruption, his storm-gray eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her to the bank building to the position of the sun in the sky. $800, he said finally, plus interest. It's probably closer to 900 by now. He nodded thoughtfully. And this banker, Cartwright, he's the one who wants to marry you? Sarah Beth's cheeks burned with embarrassment. It's not exactly a romantic proposal. More like a business transaction. The worst kind, the stranger agreed. A man should earn a woman's heart, not buy it with extortion. There was something in his tone that made Sarah Beth look at him more closely. You sound like you speak from experience. I've seen what happens when power gets twisted into control. It never ends well for anyone. He glanced toward the bank. Again, what's your name? Sarah Beth McKenna. I'm Daniel Crowfeather. My friends call me Crow. He extended his hand, and she shook it, surprised by the warmth and strength of his grip. Miss McKenna, would you mind if I asked you a question? I suppose not. If the debt was paid, all of it, in full, what would you do? Sarah Beth stared at him, certain she'd misheard. I'm sorry? If someone walked into that bank right now and paid your father's debt, what would you do with your freedom? The question was so far outside the realm of possibility that Sarah Beth had trouble processing it. I'd go home, I suppose. Try to make the homestead work. Maybe take in boarders or start a garden to sell produce in town. You'd stay in Willow Creek? It's my home. My parents are buried there. It's all I know. Crow nodded as if her answer satisfied him. And the horse? The lame one you were leading earlier? Sarah Beth's eyes widened. You saw that? I saw a woman saying goodbye to the thing she loved most. It's a hard thing to watch. Fresh tears threatened, and Sarah Beth blinked them back fiercely. Dusty's at Morrison's stable. He'll take good care of him. But you'd rather have him with you. Of course, but I can't feed him properly. And if I lose the homestead, Miss McKenna, Crow interrupted gently. What if I told you that you don't have to choose? What if there was another way? Sarah Beth shook her head. There isn't. I've considered every option, every possibility. There's no way to raise that kind of money in 2 hours. Crow reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of metal against metal. Sarah Beth's breath caught as he opened it to reveal more silver coins than she'd ever seen in one place. There is now, he said quietly. The world seemed to stop spinning. Sarah Beth stared at the coins, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. I don't understand. I'm offering to pay your debt, all of it. No conditions, no strings attached. But why? You don't even know me. Crow's smile was slow and warm, transforming his entire face. Sometimes the spirits put us exactly where we need to be, at exactly the right moment. Maybe this is one of those times. Sarah Beth felt as if she were dreaming. I could never repay you. I'm not asking you to. Consider it a gift. A gift? Sarah Beth's voice rose in disbelief. $900 is not a gift, Mr. Crowfeather. It's a fortune. Money's only worth what it can accomplish. Right now, it can accomplish something important, keeping a good woman from being forced into a bad situation. Crow's expression grew serious. But I need you to understand something. If I do this, if I walk into that bank and pay your debt, I'm not buying anything from you. Not your gratitude, not your obligation, not your future. You'll be free to make your own choices. Sarah Beth searched his face for the catch, the hidden agenda, the price that would be extracted later. She found none of those things. What she found was a man who seemed to mean exactly what he said, impossible as it seemed. "Why?" she whispered. Crow looked toward the horizon, where the mountains rose like sleeping giants against the afternoon sky. "Because someone did something similar. For my mother once, when I was just a boy. A stranger who asked for nothing in return, except that if I ever had the chance to help someone else the same way, I would." He turned back to her, his storm-gray eyes steady and certain. "This is my chance." The clock tower chimed 3:30, and Sarah Beth felt time pressing against her like a physical weight. In 30 minutes, Sheriff Collins would arrive at the bank with foreclosure papers. In 30 minutes, everything would be decided one way or another. "I don't know what to say," she said. "Say you'll let me help." Sarah Beth closed her eyes, feeling as if she stood at the edge of a cliff with nothing but faith to catch her, if she fell. Everything in her practical, careful nature screamed that this was impossible, that strangers didn't ride into town with pockets full of silver to save people they'd never met. But when she opened her eyes and saw Daniel Crowfeather waiting patiently for her answer, she realized that impossible things sometimes happened anyway. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I'll let you help." Crow's smile was like sunrise after the longest night of winter. "Then let's go see a banker about a debt." The interior of Cartwright's bank felt different with Daniel Crowfeather beside her. Sarah Beth had walked these same polished floors an hour earlier, feeling like a lamb being led to slaughter. But now the balance of power had shifted in ways that Silas Cartwright couldn't yet comprehend. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows caught the silver in Crow's hair and highlighted the quiet confidence in his bearing as he surveyed the ostentatious displays of wealth with the detached interest of a man who'd seen grander things than imported marble and gilt-framed portraits. Cartwright looked up from his ledger as they approached, his pale eyes moving from Sarah Beth to her companion with the calculating assessment of a man who made his living reading people's worth. Sarah Beth watched his expression shift from smug satisfaction to puzzlement to something approaching concern as he took in Crow's appearance, the mixture of white and Apache clothing, the silver concos on his belt, the leather medicine bag that spoke of traditions older than banks and mortgages. "Miss McKenna," Cartwright said, rising from his chair with less enthusiasm than he'd shown during her earlier visit. "I wasn't expecting you to return with ... company." "Mr. Cartwright, I'd like you to meet Daniel Crowfeather," Sarah Beth said, her voice steadier than it had been all day. "He's here regarding my father's debt." Cartwright's smile took on the brittle quality of thin ice over deep water. "I see, Mr. Crowfeather, is it? I'm afraid this is a private financial matter between Miss McKenna and my institution. Unless you're here in some official capacity ... Crow stepped forward, and Sarah Beth noticed how his presence seemed to fill the room in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. There was something about him that commanded attention, not through bluster or intimidation, but through a quiet authority that spoke of a man who'd never needed to prove himself to anyone. "I'm here to settle the debt," Crow said simply. The words hung in the air like the echo of a church bell. Cartwright blinked, his mouth opening and closing silently as he processed what he'd just heard. His clerk, a nervous young man named Henderson, looked up from his paperwork with undisguised amazement. "I beg your pardon?" Cartwright managed finally. Crow reached into his coat and withdrew the leather pouch Sarah Beth had seen earlier. The soft clink of silver coins was the only sound in the suddenly quiet bank. "Thomas McKenna's debt to your institution. I'm here to pay it in full." Cartwright's face cycled through a series of emotions: disbelief, anger, calculation, and finally, a kind of desperate cunning. "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple, Mr. Crowfeather. The debt is Miss McKenna's responsibility now, and there are complications regarding the transfer of such obligations to third parties." Sarah Beth felt her heart sink. Of course, it wouldn't be simple. Men like Cartwright didn't build fortunes by allowing their carefully laid plans to be disrupted by inconvenient acts of generosity. But Crow merely smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both pleasant and utterly implacable. What complications might those be, Mr. Cartwright? The promissory note doesn't specify who can make payment, only that payment must be made. Well, there are questions of propriety and legal standing. Cartwright's voice grew more strained with each word. A young unmarried woman accepting such a substantial sum from a AA. From a what, Mr. Cartwright? Crow's voice remained perfectly calm, but something in his tone made the banker take a half-step backward. From a stranger, of course. Surely. You can understand my concern for Miss McKenna's reputation. Sarah Beth felt anger flare in her chest like a struck match. My reputation, Mr. Cartwright? You weren't concerned about my reputation an hour ago when you proposed that I marry you to settle this debt. Cartwright's face reddened. That was an entirely different matter. A proper marriage arrangement between established families. Was extortion, Crow interrupted quietly. Nothing more, nothing less. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Cartwright drew himself up to his full height, which was still several inches shorter than Crow, and attempted to project an authority he clearly didn't feel. Sir, I'll thank you not to characterize my business dealings in such inflammatory terms. The arrangement I proposed to Miss McKenna was perfectly legitimate, was it? Crow pulled a folded document from his inside pocket and laid it on Cartwright's desk. Because according to the territorial banking regulations, I reviewed this morning. Using foreclosure proceedings to coerce personal relationships constitutes criminal harassment under Section 12 of the Territorial Code. Sarah Beth stared at the document, recognizing the official seal of the territorial government. Cartwright's face had gone pale as he scanned the text, his lips moving silently as he read. Where did you get this? Cartwright whispered. I had business in Santa Fe last week. Took the opportunity to research the relevant laws regarding debt collection and banking practices. Crow's tone was conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. Fascinating reading. Did you know that threatening foreclosure without following proper notification procedures can result in criminal charges? Or that using personal relationships to influence financial transactions is considered a form of fraud? Cartwright sank into his chair, the document trembling in his hands. This is this is preposterous. I've done nothing illegal, haven't you? Crow pulled another paper from his pocket. This is a statement from Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who operates the boarding house on Elm Street. She was quite talkative about the conversation she overheard last month between you and Mayor Hutchins regarding your plans to acquire the McKenna property one way or another. She was particularly disturbed by your comment that a desperate woman will agree to almost anything. Sarah Beth felt the blood drain from her face. She remembered seeing Mrs. Patterson at the hotel that day, remembered wondering why the older woman had looked at her with such sympathy. Now she understood. That conversation was taken out of context, Cartwright stammered. Was it? Because I also have a statement from Jake Morrison at the livery stable, who recalls you asking him detailed questions about Miss McKenna's financial situation and whether she had any male relatives who might interfere with your plans. Crow's voice remained calm, but his eyes had grown as cold as winter steel. Quite a pattern of predatory behavior, wouldn't you say? Cartwright's hands were shaking now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. What do you want? I want you to accept payment for Thomas McKenna's debt, provide a receipt marked paid in full, and return all documents related to the McKenna property. Crow's tone was reasonable, almost friendly. In exchange, these statements and my research into your business practices remain private. The banker's mouth worked soundlessly for several seconds. Sarah Beth watched the man who'd held her future in his hands just an hour earlier reduced to a sweating, desperate figure behind an oversized desk. "The debt," Cartwright said weakly. It's $947 with accrued interest." Crow opened his leather pouch and began counting out silver coins with methodical precision. Each piece clinked against the desk like a small bell tolling the end of Cartwright's schemes. Sarah Beth watched in fascination as the pile grew more money than she'd ever seen in one place, more money than most families in Willow Creek would see in 5 years. $947, Crow said when he finished counting. "I believe that settles the matter." Cartwright stared at the silver as if it might disappear if he looked away. With trembling hands, he opened his desk drawer and withdrew the promissory note that had haunted Sarah Beth's dreams. He picked up his pen, dipped it in ink, and wrote "Paid in full" across the bottom in shaky letters. "There," he said, his voice barely audible. "The debt is satisfied." Sarah Beth felt her knees go weak with relief. After months of worry, weeks of desperation, and hours of terror, it was over. The paper that had represented her family's destruction was now just an artifact, a reminder of a crisis that had passed like a summer storm. But Crow wasn't finished. "The property deed, Mr. Cartwright, and any other documents you're holding as collateral." Cartwright fumbled through his files, producing a thick folder of papers. Sarah Beth recognized her father's careful handwriting on several documents, including the original deed to the McKenna homestead that her grandfather had filed 30 years earlier. "Everything's there," Cartwright said. "The property is clear of all liens and encumbrances." Crow gathered the papers and handed them to Sarah Beth. The feel of the deed in her hands was like touching solid ground after months of drowning. Her home was safe. Her parents' graves would remain undisturbed. The life her family had built was hers to continue or change as she saw fit. "Thank you, Mr. Cartwright," Crow said with perfect politeness. "I'm sure Miss McKenna appreciates your cooperation in this matter." They walked out of the bank in silence, Sarah Beth clutching the papers to her chest like a lifeline. The afternoon sun seemed brighter than before, the dusty street more welcoming. Even the familiar buildings of Willow Creek looked different. Somehow, as if she were seeing them clearly for the first time in months. It wasn't until they were well away from the bank that Sarah Beth found her voice. "How did you know?" "About the territorial laws, about Mrs. Patterson's statement." Crow's smile was enigmatic. "I didn't ride into town by accident, Sarah Beth. I've been watching Cartwright for some time, waiting for him to overreach himself. You were just the excuse I needed to act, watching him." "Why?" They had reached Morrison's livery stable, where Dusty was visible in his stall, contentedly munching hay. The horse looked up at Sarah Beth's approach and whinnied softly, as if he somehow knew that their troubles were over. "Because Silas Cartwright isn't just a crook banker," Crow said, his expression growing serious. "He's part of a larger operation that's been systematically stealing land from small farmers and ranchers throughout the territory. The debt scheme he tried on you? He's used it dozens of times before." Sarah Beth stopped walking. "You're saying this was all planned? That my father's loan was part of some larger conspiracy? Your father's mining partner, the one who died in the cave-in? His name was Miguel Santos, and he didn't die in an accident. He was murdered by men working for a mining syndicate that wanted his claims. They made it look like an accident, then approached your father with an offer to help extract the equipment and salvage something from the venture." The world seemed to tilt around Sarah Beth. "My father never said. He never told me. Because he didn't know. Santos had discovered something in those mines, something valuable enough to kill for. The syndicate needed to control the claims quietly, without attracting attention from the territorial government. So they created a chain of debt and foreclosure that would give them legal ownership of the land." Sarah Beth felt sick. "And my father was just, what? Collateral damage?" "Your father was a good man who tried to help a friend and got caught in a web he never saw coming." Crow's voice was gentle but firm. The illness that killed him? That wasn't natural either. There's a reason Dr. Henley couldn't identify what was wrong with him. The implications hit Sarah Beth like a physical blow. You're saying they murdered my father? I'm saying that men like Cartwright don't build their fortunes on luck and honest dealing. They build them on other people's suffering, and they don't much care who gets hurt in the process. Crow paused, studying her face. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Sarah Beth stared at him, her mind reeling from everything she'd learned. Her father's death, the debt that had nearly destroyed her, the forced choice between marriage and destitution, all of it had been orchestrated by men who saw her family as nothing more than obstacles to their greed. What can I do? I'm just one person, and they have money, power, influence. You have something more valuable than any of those things, Crow said. You have the truth. And you have allies, if you're willing to accept help. Allies? Crow gestured toward the town around them. Jake Morrison knew something was wrong, but didn't know how to prove it. Mrs. Patterson has been collecting information about Cartwright's activities for months. Even Dr. Henley has been asking questions about the unusual number of deaths among small landowners in the area. Sarah Beth felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in months' hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning woman grasping for salvation, but the steady hope of someone who saw a path forward through the darkness. What would we need to do? First, we gather evidence. Real proof of what Cartwright and his associates have been doing. Then we take it to someone with the authority to act on it. Crow's eyes gleamed with determination. I know a federal marshal in Santa Fe who's been investigating territorial land fraud. He'd be very interested in what we've learned. Sarah Beth looked at the deed in her hands, then at Dusty in his stall, then at the town that had been her whole world until an hour ago. Everything had changed, but more than that, everything was possible now. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was someone who could fight back. When do we start? She asked. Crow's smile was like sunrise over the desert, full of warmth and promise. We already have. Jake Morrison appeared from the depths of his stable, his weathered face creased with concern. Sarah Beth, everything all right? I saw you go into the bank with. He paused, taking in Crow's appearance with the careful assessment of a man who'd lived on the frontier long enough to recognize both friend and foe. Jake, I'd like you to meet Daniel Crow Feather, Sarah Beth said. He just saved my life. Morrison extended his hand, and Crow shook it with the firm grip of equals. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Crow Feather. Though I'm curious how a man saves someone's life in a bank. By paying her father's debt and exposing Silas Cartwright for the criminal. He is, Sarah Beth said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Jake, did you know that Cartwright has been systematically targeting small landowners throughout the territory? Morrison's expression darkened. I suspected something like that. Too many good folks losing their places to bad luck and worse timing. But suspecting and proving are different things. Not anymore, Crow said. He reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a thick folder. I've been collecting evidence for months. Bank records, witness statements, documentation of the mining syndicate's activities. What I needed was a local incident dramatic enough to get the territorial authorities' attention. Sarah Beth realized what he was saying. You knew Cartwright would try to force me into marriage. You were counting on it. I was hoping he'd overreach himself, yes. Men like Cartwright always do, eventually. Their greed makes them careless. Crow's expression grew apologetic. I'm sorry you had to go through that ordeal, but it gave us the evidence we needed to connect his personal crimes to the larger conspiracy. Morrison rubbed his chin thoughtfully. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Crow opened the folder, revealing dozens of documents, bank transfers, correspondence between Cartwright and unknown associates, maps showing properties that had been foreclosed and immediately transferred to mining interests. Sarah Beth saw her family's homestead marked on one of the maps, along with at least 20 other properties throughout the region. Holy hell, Morrison breathed. This goes all the way up to the territorial capital. And beyond, Crow confirmed. There are connections to mining interests in Colorado and California, railroad companies looking to acquire right-of-way, even some federal officials who've been turning a blind eye in exchange for personal consideration. Sarah Beth studied the maps, seeing the scope of the conspiracy for the first time. Her family's tragedy wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic campaign to steal the best land in the territory from the people who'd worked to build something meaningful on it. What happens now? Morrison asked. Now we take this to Marshall Thompson in Santa Fe, Crow said. But first, we need to make sure the evidence is complete and that everyone involved in gathering it is protected. Protected from what? Sarah Beth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. From the same thing that happened to Miguel Santos and your father, Crow said quietly. Men who've killed to protect their secrets won't hesitate to kill again if they feel threatened. The weight of the situation settled over Sarah Beth like a heavy blanket. She'd thought her troubles were over when Crow paid her debt, but she was beginning to understand that the payment was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous journey. You're asking me to risk my life to expose these people, she said. I'm asking you to help me stop them from destroying more families like yours, Crow replied. But the choice is yours, Sarah Beth. You're free now, free to walk away, to start over somewhere else, to pretend none of this ever happened. Sarah Beth looked at Dusty, who was watching her with the patient intelligence of an animal who'd shared her sorrows and understood her heart. She thought of her parents buried on the hill behind their homestead, and of Miguel Santos, whose death had started the chain of events that nearly destroyed her life. She thought of other families who might be facing the same impossible choices she'd faced just hours earlier. No, she said finally. I'm not walking away. These people killed my father and tried to steal everything my family built. If there's a chance to stop them, I have to take it. Crow nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. Then we'd better get started. We have a lot of work to do and not much time to do it. As the three of them stood in the stable yard, making plans to take on a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, Sarah Beth felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death purpose. Not just the purpose of survival, but the purpose of justice. The debt was paid, but the real fight was just beginning. The McKenna homestead sat in a valley carved by wind and time. 40 acres of stubborn hope scratched from the high desert. Sarah Beth hadn't been home in 3 days, not since the morning she'd walked to town expecting to lose everything. Now riding beside Daniel Crowfeather as the sun painted the western mountains gold and crimson, she saw her family's land with new eyes, not as a burden she was about to lose, but as something worth fighting for. The house her grandfather had built was modest but solid, constructed from local stone and timber with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of a man who'd intended his work to last generations. The barn behind it showed her father's improvements, a larger hayloft, reinforced stalls, and the workshop where he'd spent countless hours repairing equipment and crafting the small luxuries that made frontier life bearable. But it was the two graves on the hill behind the house that drew Sarah Beth's attention as they approached. Simple wooden crosses marked where her parents lay side by side, facing the sunrise they'd watched together for 25 years of marriage. Someone had placed fresh wildflowers on both graves, purple lupins and Indian paintbrush that grew wild in the high meadows. Mrs. Patterson, Sarah Beth murmured, recognizing the older woman's kindness. She must have been keeping watch over the place. Crow dismounted and helped Sarah Beth down from his horse, his hands steady and warm around her waist. For a moment they stood close enough that she could smell the sage and leather scent of him, could see the flecks of silver in his storm-gray eyes. Then he stepped back and she found herself oddly disappointed by the return of proper distance. between them. "Your father built this place to last," Crow observed, studying the careful construction with an expert eye. "3 generations of McKennas have worked this land," Sarah Beth replied, leading him toward the house. "Grandfather came out here in '52 with nothing but a wagon, 2 horses, and a determination to prove that decent folks could make a life in this country." She unlocked the front door, and they stepped into the main room that had been the heart of her family's life. Everything was exactly as she'd left it 3 days earlier, her father's chair by the fireplace, her mother's quilts folded neatly. On the sofa, the kitchen table where they'd shared countless meals and where Thomas McKenna had signed the promissory note that nearly destroyed his daughter's future. But now, with Crow beside her and the truth of her father's death beginning to emerge, the familiar surroundings felt different. Not like a shrine to the past, but like the foundation for whatever came next. "Show me where your father kept his papers," Crow said gently. Sarah Beth led into the small office off the main room, where a desk built from split pine held the accumulated business of a lifetime. She opened the drawers systematically, revealing folders of correspondence, receipts from livestock sales, and the careful records her father had maintained of every transaction, every improvement, every dollar earned and spent. Crow examined the papers with the methodical attention of a man who'd learned to read between the lines of official documents. "Here," he said, pulling out a letter dated 6 months before Thomas McKenna's death. "This is from Miguel Santos, written just weeks before he was killed." Sarah Beth read over his shoulder, her father's friend's familiar handwriting bringing back memories of the cheerful Mexican prospector who'd been a frequent visitor to their dinner table. But this letter carried none of Miguel's usual optimism. Instead, it spoke of concerns about his mining partners, suspicions that they were more interested in the land than the ore, and a growing fear that he'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than he'd realized. "He says here that he found something in the Copper Ridge mine," Sarah Beth said, pointing to a passage near the end of the letter. "Something that made him want to bring in outside investors instead of relying on his current partners." "Keep reading," Crow said quietly. The next paragraph made Sarah Beth's blood run cold. Miguel wrote that he'd overheard his partners discussing plans to acquire additional properties in the area through foreclosure and intimidation. He mentioned names including Silas Cartwright and described a network of corruption that extended far beyond simple mining interests. "He was going to expose them," Sarah Beth whispered. "And your father was the only person he trusted with the information," Crow replied. "Look at this." He showed her another letter, this one in her father's handwriting, addressed to Miguel, but never sent. In it, Thomas McKenna urged his friend to take his concerns to the territorial authorities, offering to provide testimony about the suspicious activities he'd witnessed in town. "Daddy knew," Sarah Beth said, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "He knew something was wrong, and he was going to help Miguel prove it. Until Miguel was killed and your father was approached with that loan offer," Crow said grimly. "They needed him silent, and they found a way to ensure his cooperation." Sarah Beth sank into her father's chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd discovered. The mining venture was never real, was it? It was all a setup to get him into debt. Worse than that, they needed access to this property specifically. Crow spread out a surveyor's map he'd found among the papers. "Look at the location of your land relative to the other properties they've acquired." Sarah Beth studied the map, seeing the pattern for the first time. The McKenna homestead sat at the center of a rough circle of lands that had all been foreclosed or sold under suspicious circumstances over the past 2 years. Together, they formed a corridor that stretched from the Copper Ridge mining district all the way to the railroad depot in Millfield, 30 miles to the east. "They're building a transportation route," she realized, "from the mines to the railroad." "But not for copper," Crow said. "Miguel found something else in those mines, something valuable enough to kill for and worth building a private railroad spur to transport." "What could be that valuable?" Crow pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and opened it to reveal several chunks of rock that glittered with veins of yellow metal. "Gold," he said simply, "not just traces or small deposits." Miguel found what the geological survey missed, a major vein that runs through the entire Copper Ridge Formation. Sarah Beth stared at the ore samples, understanding at last why her family had been targeted. "And our land sits right in the path of the most efficient route to get it to market. Your land and about 20 others. The syndicate has been systematically acquiring the properties they need, using bankruptcy, foreclosure, and when necessary, murder to clear the way." Crow's expression was grim. "They're close to having everything they need. Your father's death and your forced marriage to Cartwright would have given them the last piece of the puzzle." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Sarah Beth moved to the window and saw 3 riders approaching the house at a gallop, dust rising behind them like a warning banner. "Trouble," she said, recognizing the lead rider's bulky silhouette. Crow joined her at the window, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. "Friends of Cartwright?" "Worse, that's Bull Garrett and his boys. They work for whoever pays best, and they're not particular about what kind of work they do." The 3 men reined in their horses in the yard, making no effort to appear friendly or peaceful. Bull Garrett was a mountain of a man with small, cruel eyes and the kind of smile that promised pain. His companions, the Henley brothers, were cut from the same cloth men who'd found their calling in other people's misery. "Miss McKenna," Garrett called out, not bothering to dismount. "Heard you had some excitement in town today. Thought we'd ride out and make sure you were ... safe." Sarah Beth stepped onto the porch, Crow beside her. She could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge, controlled but ready to explode into action if needed. "I'm perfectly safe, Mr. Garrett. Thank you for your concern." Garrett's gaze shifted to Crow, taking in his mixed heritage and the quiet confidence of his bearing. "Don't believe we've been introduced, friend. You seem a long way from the reservation." "I'm exactly where I need to be," Crow replied, his voice calm but carrying an undertone that made Garrett's horse shift nervously. "See, that's interesting," Garrett continued, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Because word around town is that you caused quite a stir at the bank today. Paid off some debts, asked a lot of questions. The kind of questions that make certain people ... uncomfortable." "Certain people should be uncomfortable," Sarah Beth said, stepping forward. "If they've done things worth being uncomfortable about." One of the Henley brothers laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Feisty little thing, ain't she? No wonder Cartwright was so eager to marry her." The comment hit its mark, and Sarah Beth felt her cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. But before she could respond, Crow moved. Not dramatically or violently, but with the fluid grace of a predator claiming its territory. Suddenly he was standing between Sarah Beth and the mounted men, and something in his posture made all 3 horses take a step backward. "Gentlemen," Crow said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from absolute confidence in one's ability to back up any threat made. "Miss McKenna has asked you to leave. I suggest you honor her request." Garrett's facade of casual intimidation cracked slightly. "This is private property, Breed. Our business is with the lady, not with you." "Your business is with whoever chooses to stand with her," Crow replied. "And right now that's me." The standoff stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Sarah Beth could feel the violence hanging in the air like the electric charge before a thunderstorm. These were men who solved problems with bullets and fists, and she was suddenly, terrifyingly aware of how isolated the homestead was. But Crow showed no sign of backing down. If anything, he seemed to grow more still, more centered, like a mountain that had decided it wasn't going anywhere. "You're making a mistake, Breed," Garrett said finally, but his bluster lacked conviction. "There's 3 of us and 1 of you. Crow's smile was winter cold and sharp as a knife edge. "You're making the mistake, friend. You're assuming those are good odds." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind sighing through the sage and the creak of leather as the horses shifted under their riders. Then Garrett seemed to reach some internal calculation and decided discretion was the better part of valor. "This ain't over," he said, pulling his horse's head around. "There's more than one way to solve a problem." "Yes," Crow agreed pleasantly. "There are. Choose your next step carefully." The three men rode away, but their departure felt more like a tactical retreat than a victory. Sarah Beth watched them disappear over the ridge, knowing they'd be back with reinforcements and a different approach. "They'll return tonight," Crow said, echoing her thoughts. "Probably with more men, and they won't be interested in conversation." Sarah Beth nodded, surprised by how calm she felt. The fear was there, but underneath it was something stronger, a determination that had been building since she'd first seen her father's letters and understood the scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. "Then we'd better be ready for them," she said. Crow turned to look at her, and she saw approval in his storm-gray eyes. "We? This is my land, my fight. If you're planning to make a stand here, you're not making it alone." For the first time since she'd met him, Crow's composure cracked slightly. Something that might have been admiration flickered across his features, followed quickly by concern. "Sarah Beth, these men are killers. They won't hesitate to what? Murder me like they murdered my father?" The words came out harder than she'd intended, but she didn't soften them. "They already tried to destroy my life once. I won't give them a second chance." Crow studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right then. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Help me gather everything we need to prove the conspiracy. Every letter, every document, every piece of evidence your father collected." They worked quickly and efficiently, sorting through years of correspondence and business records. By the time the sun touched the western peaks, they had assembled a comprehensive picture of the syndicate's activities, names, dates, financial transactions, and most importantly, Miguel Santos's detailed documentation of the gold discovery that had started it all. "This is enough to bring down the entire operation," Crow said, sealing the papers in a waterproof pouch. "If we can get it to Marshal Thompson in Santa Fe." "When?" Sarah Beth corrected. "When we get it to Santa Fe." Crow's smile was warm despite the danger closing around them. "When?" he agreed. As darkness fell over the valley, they prepared for what they both knew would be a long and dangerous night. The truth was finally within reach, but first they had to survive to tell it. The moon hung like a silver coin in the star-scattered sky, casting long shadows across the McKenna homestead. Sarah Beth crouched behind the stone wall of her father's workshop, a Winchester rifle cradled in her arms, and her heart beating so hard she was certain it could be heard across the valley. Beside her, Daniel Crowfeather moved with the silent grace of his Apache heritage, checking their defensive positions one final time before the storm broke. They had spent the hours after sunset preparing for war. Every window in the house was barricaded except for narrow firing slits. The barn doors were reinforced and positioned to provide crossfire across the yard. Most importantly, Crow had taught Sarah Beth the warrior's art of patience, how to wait in absolute stillness until the moment for action arrived. "Remember," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear, "they'll try to flush us out with fire. Don't let them draw you into the open. Stay low, stay quiet, and when you shoot, make every bullet count." Sarah Beth nodded, surprised by how steady her hands felt despite the terror clawing at her chest. 3 days ago, she'd been a desperate woman walking toward financial ruin. Now she was a defender of her family's legacy, armed and ready to fight men who'd murdered her father. The transformation felt both foreign and natural, as if she'd discovered something that had always been part of her, but had never been awakened. The first sign of trouble came from Dusty, the lame horse, stabled in the barn with Crow's magnificent black stallion, began to pace restlessly in his stall. His ears flicked forward and back, and he released a low, nervous whicker that carried clearly in the still night air. "They're coming," Crow murmured, and Sarah Beth saw him shift into a crouch that spoke of coiled violence, ready to explode into deadly motion. The attack began not with gunfire, but with flames. Burning arrows arced through the darkness like falling stars, striking the barn roof and the wooden fence posts around the corral. Within minutes, half a dozen small fires were crackling to life, painting the night in shades of orange and gold. "Clever," Crow admitted grudgingly. "Force us to choose between defending the buildings and defending ourselves." Sarah Beth watched. Flames lick at the barn where Dusty was stabled and felt fury rise in her throat like bile. These men weren't just trying to kill her. They were trying to destroy everything her family had built, every physical reminder that the McKennas had ever existed. "I won't let them burn it," she said, starting to rise. Crow's hand fell on her shoulder, firm but gentle. "That's what they want. The moment you leave cover, they'll cut you down. But Dusty is safer in the barn than you would be in the open. Stone and adobe don't burn easily, and horses are smarter than people give them credit for." His voice carried absolute conviction. "Trust him to survive. Trust me to keep you alive." The sound of hoofbeats thundered across the valley as riders emerged from the darkness like demons rising from hell. Sarah Beth counted at least 8 men, more than twice what they'd faced that afternoon. Bull Garrett's voice boomed across the yard, amplified by the natural acoustics of the valley. "McKenna, you and your breed friend come out with your hands up, and maybe we'll make this quick." Sarah Beth raised her rifle to the firing slit, sighting down the barrel at the bulky figure of Garrett, silhouetted against the firelight. The shot would be difficult in the uncertain light, but not impossible. Her finger tightened on the trigger. "Wait," Crow breathed. "Let them come closer. Make the first shot count." The riders spread out across the yard in a practiced pattern that spoke of men who'd done this kind of work before. 2 moved toward the barn, obviously intending to release the horses and eliminate any possibility of escape. 3 more took positions behind the water trough and tool shed, creating a crossfire that would make movement between the buildings deadly. The remaining 3, including Garrett, approached the house directly. "Last chance, McKenna," Garrett shouted. "We know you're in there, and we know what you found. Hand over those papers, and we might let you live." Sarah Beth felt Crow tense beside her. The demand confirmed what they'd both suspected. This wasn't just about eliminating witnesses. The syndicate desperately needed to destroy the evidence that could bring down their entire operation. "They can't afford to let us live," she whispered. "Even if we gave them the papers." "I know," Crow replied grimly, "which means we fight until we can't fight anymore." One of the men approaching the barn made the mistake of stepping into the full glare of the firelight. Sarah Beth drew a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's sharp crack echoed across the valley, and the man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder and screaming curses that would have made a sailor blush. "There! In the workshop!" Garrett roared, and suddenly the night exploded with gunfire. Bullets whined off the stone walls like angry hornets, sending chips of rock flying and forcing Sarah Beth to duck below the window. Beside her, Crow was returning fire with methodical precision, his rifle speaking in measured cadences that suggested. Each shot was carefully aimed rather than wildly sprayed. 2 down, he reported calmly, as if discussing the weather. 1 behind the water trough, 1 near the corral gate. Sarah Beth risked a glance over the windowsill and saw one of the Henley brothers dragging his wounded companion toward the cover of the barn. She tracked him with her rifle and fired, the bullet kicking up dirt just inches from his boots. He dove for cover, abandoning his friend in the open. "Getting better," Crow observed with what might have been approval. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm of fire and movement. The attackers tried to advance under cover of darkness, only to be driven back by accurate shooting from the workshop. Sarah Beth discovered she had a natural talent for reading the patterns of their movement, anticipating where a man would appear next and putting her shots exactly where they needed to be. But the defenders' advantage was temporary. The raiders had more men, more ammunition, and most critically, more fire arrows. The barn roof was now fully ablaze, and flames were beginning to spread to the hay stored in the loft. "We have to get the horses out," Sarah Beth said, watching smoke pour from the barn's ventilation slats. "Agreed, but not the way they expect." Crow pointed toward the back of the barn, where a small door opened onto the hillside pasture. "Can you keep them pinned down for 60 seconds? Sarah Beth checked her ammunition, 4 rounds left in the rifle, plus the revolver her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12. "I can try. Don't try, do it." Crow's hand touched her cheek, a gentle caress that somehow conveyed more affection than a dozen flowery speeches. "I'll get the horses to safety and circle around behind them. When you hear gunfire from the ridge, make your move toward the house." Before she could protest or ask for details, he was gone, slipping out the workshop's rear door and vanishing into the shadows like smoke dissipating in wind. Sarah Beth was alone, facing 8 armed men with nothing but her father's rifle and a determination that burned hotter than the flames consuming her barn. She began firing in a steady rhythm, not trying for killing shots, but focusing on keeping the attackers pinned in their positions. Every time a head appeared above cover, she put a bullet close enough to make the man think twice about advancing. The Winchester's magazine emptied faster than she'd hoped, forcing her to switch to the revolver. The pistol's shorter range meant letting the enemy get closer, but it also meant more decisive engagements. When one of the Henley brothers made a dash toward the house, Sarah Beth tracked him with the revolver's sights and fired at point-blank range. The man stumbled and fell, clutching his leg and screaming for his companions to help him. From the ridge behind the barn came the sharp crack of rifle fire, followed by shouts of alarm and confusion. Crow had reached the horses and was now engaging the attackers from an unexpected angle. Sarah Beth used the distraction to sprint from the workshop toward the house, zigzagging to avoid the bullets that whined past her head. She reached the kitchen door just as Bull Garrett kicked in the front entrance. The big man's face was streaked with soot and fury, and his gun was already rising toward her when she put 2 bullets from the revolver into his chest. Garrett's expression shifted from rage to surprise to nothing at all as he toppled backward onto the porch. The sudden silence that followed was more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Sarah Beth crouched beside the kitchen window, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for the next assault. But instead of renewed gunfire, she heard the sound of horses galloping away into the night. Crow appeared in the doorway like a ghost materializing from shadow, leading both Dusty and his own stallion. The horses were singed but unharmed, and Dusty's limp seemed less pronounced than usual, as if the excitement had somehow strengthened his injured leg. "It's over," Crow said simply. The survivors decided discretion was the better part of valor. Sarah Beth looked around at the destruction, the burning barn, the bullet-scarred walls, the body of Bull Garrett cooling on her front porch. Everything her family had built was damaged or destroyed, but somehow the core of it remained. The house still stood, the land was still theirs, and she was still alive to continue the fight. "How many?" she asked. 3 dead, including Garrett. 4 wounded, all fled. The Henley brothers were among the casualties. Crow's expression was grim but satisfied. "Word will get back to Cartwright and his associates that the McKenna homestead isn't as easy a target as they assumed." Sarah Beth sank into her father's chair, suddenly exhausted by the adrenaline crash that followed mortal combat. "They'll send more men. Professionals this time. Probably. But not tonight, and maybe not tomorrow either. They'll need time to regroup and figure out their next move." Crow knelt beside the chair, his storm-gray eyes searching her face. Sarah Beth, you fought like a warrior tonight. Your father would have been proud. The words hit her harder than any bullet could have. For the first time since the gunfire stopped, tears began to flow not from fear or grief, but from a kind of fierce pride in what she'd accomplished. She'd defended her family's legacy against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. I killed a man tonight, she said quietly. You defended your home against men who came to murder you, Crow corrected gently. There's no shame in that and no guilt you need to carry. Sarah Beth looked at him through the tears, seeing not just the mysterious stranger who'd paid her debt, but the man who'd stood beside her through the darkest night of her life, who'd taught her to fight and given her the strength to survive. Daniel, she whispered, using his given name for the first time. Yes? Thank you. For everything. For the debt, for the truth about my father, for teaching me how to be strong. She paused, gathering courage for words that felt more dangerous than facing armed raiders. For making me believe I was worth saving. His smile was like sunrise. After the longest night, warm and full of promise. Sarah Beth McKenna, you were always worth saving. You just needed to believe it yourself. Outside, the barn continued to burn, but the flames no longer seemed like destruction. They seemed like purification, burning away the old fears and limitations that had defined her life before this night. When morning came, she would rebuild stronger, wiser, and with a partner who understood the true meaning of standing together against the darkness. The war was far from over, but the first battle was won. Dawn broke over the McKenna homestead. Like a benediction, painting the smoke-stained valley in shades of gold and rose. Sarah Beth stood in the ruins of her barn, sifting through the ashes for anything that might have survived the fire. The acrid smell of burned wood and hay hung heavy in the morning air, but underneath it she caught the scent of sage and possibility carried on the desert wind. Daniel, Crow Feather emerged from the house, carrying 2 traveling packs and a pot of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. He'd spent the hours before sunrise methodically preparing for the journey to Santa Fe, gathering supplies and studying maps by lamplight, while Sarah Beth dozed fitfully in her father's chair. The evidence is secure, he said, handing her a tin cup filled with coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Double wrapped in oilcloth and distributed between both packs. Even if we lose one, the other will be enough to convict the entire syndicate. Sarah Beth accepted the coffee gratefully, using the warmth to chase away the chill that seemed to have settled in her bones. The night's battle had left her feeling hollow and strange, as if she'd shed an old skin and hadn't yet grown comfortable in the new one. How long to reach Santa Fe, she asked. 4 days hard riding, if we push the horses and avoid the main roads. Crow's expression was serious as he studied the horizon. But Sarah Beth, once we leave this valley, there's no turning back. Cartwright and his associates will know we're coming, and they'll do everything in their power to stop us. She looked around at the charred remains of the barn, at the bullet holes scarring the workshop walls, at the graves on the hill where her parents lay. Everything that had defined her life was here, but it was also more fragile than she'd ever realized. Last night had proven that her enemies could reach her anywhere, could destroy anything she tried to build or protect. There's nothing to turn back to, she said finally. Not if we don't finish this. Crow nodded, understanding passing between them like a current of electricity. They were no longer just allies of convenience or even friends united by circumstance. They were partners in the truest sense, bound together by shared purpose and the knowledge that neither could complete this mission alone. There's something else we need to discuss, Crow said, his voice carefully neutral. The journey to Santa Fe will require us to travel together, sleep in the same camps, depend on each other for survival. People will make assumptions about our relationship. Sarah Beth felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. What kind of assumptions? That we're married, or at least promised to each other." He paused, studying her face. In Apache culture, when a man and woman travel together as we're about to do, it's understood to be a declaration of intent. And in white culture, it's understood to be a scandal that ruins the woman's reputation. Sarah Beth smiled ruefully. "I suppose it doesn't matter much, considering that my reputation was already compromised the moment I accepted your help with the debt." "It matters to me," Crow said quietly. "Your honor matters to me." The simple declaration hit her like a physical blow, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was so unexpectedly powerful. In the space of 3 days, this man had saved her from financial ruin, taught her to fight for her life, and now was willing to protect even her social standing, in a world that had already judged her harshly. "Daniel," she said, using his given name deliberately, "my honor isn't something that can be damaged by other people's opinions. It's something I carry inside myself, and it's stronger now than it was before I met you." His smile was like sunrise over the mountains, warm and full of promise. "Then we ride together and let the world think what it will." They loaded their packs onto the horses with the efficient cooperation of people who'd learned to trust each other completely. Dusty seemed stronger this morning, his limp barely noticeable as he danced sideways with excitement at the prospect of a journey. Crow's black stallion, whom Sarah Beth had learned was called Thunder, stood patient and alert as his rider checked the saddle rigging one final time. "We'll take the old mining road through Devil's Canyon," Crow explained, tracing their route on a hand-drawn map. "It's rough traveling, but it keeps us away from the main trails where they'll be watching for us." Sarah Beth studied the map, noting the distances between water sources and the elevation changes that would test both horses and riders. That route adds at least a day to the journey. Better to arrive late than not at all. Crow folded the map and tucked it into his saddlebags. "Besides, there's something I want to show you along the way. Something that will help explain why this fight matters so much." They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, leaving the valley that had been home to 3 generations of McKennas. Sarah Beth turned in her saddle for one last look at the homestead, memorizing the way the morning light fell across the stone walls and the wild roses that grew beside her mother's kitchen garden. "We'll be back," Crow said, reading her thoughts. "Will we?" Sarah Beth asked. "Even if we stop the syndicate, even if we bring them to justice, everything here is damaged or destroyed. It would take years to rebuild, and I'm not sure I have the strength to do it alone." "Who says you'd be doing it alone?" The question hung in the air between them, like a promise half-spoken. Sarah Beth felt her heart skip, but before she could respond, Crow spurred Thunder into a canter that made further conversation impossible. The old mining road lived up to its reputation for difficulty. Cut into the side of Devil's Canyon by prospectors who'd cared more about speed than safety, it wound through terrain that challenged both horse and rider at every turn. Loose shale shifted under the horse's hooves, and more than once Sarah Beth found herself looking down into abysses that seemed to have no bottom, but the harsh beauty of the landscape was breathtaking. Red rock walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes that resembled castles, cathedrals, and sleeping giants. Hawks soared on the thermals that rose from the canyon floor, and somewhere in the distance, the haunting call of a coyote echoed off the stone walls. "Your ancestors traveled through country like this," Sarah Beth said during a rest stop, watching Crow study their rock formations with the eye of someone who could read the stories written in stone. "My mother's people, yes. The Chiricahua Apache knew every water hole, every game trail, every place where a warrior could find shelter or an enemy could set an ambush." Crow's voice carried a note of pride mixed with sadness. They could live off this land for months without ever being seen by white eyes. "Could you?" "I could try. But I'm not fully Apache, just as I'm not fully white. I live between 2 worlds, accepted completely by neither." He turned to look at her, his storm-gray eyes reflecting depths she was only beginning to fathom. It's a lonely way to live until you find someone who understands what it means to be caught between what you were born to be and what the world expects you to become. Sarah Beth felt the words resonate in her chest like the tolling of a bell. She'd spent her entire life caught between the expectations of frontier society and her own dreams of independence, between duty to her family's legacy and the desire to forge her own path. "Is that what I am?" she asked quietly. "Someone caught between worlds? You're someone brave enough to create your own world when the existing ones don't fit." Crow's smile was gentle but certain. "That's rarer than you might think." They rode on, the conversation creating an intimacy that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with the recognition of kindred spirits. As the day progressed, Sarah Beth found herself studying Crow's profile as he navigated the treacherous trail, noting the way he moved in perfect harmony with his horse, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for signs of danger or opportunity. In the afternoon, they reached the place Crow had wanted to show her. The canyon opened into a hidden valley, green with grass and dotted with ancient ruins that spoke of a civilization far older than anything European settlers had built in the territory. Stone walls rose from the valley floor, perfectly fitted together without mortar, while carved symbols decorated the faces of the surrounding cliffs. "Anasazi," Crow explained, dismounting to walk among the ruins. "The ancient ones. My grandmother's grandmother told stories of the people who built this place, before the Apache came to this country, before the Spanish, before anyone who lives here now." Sarah Beth followed him into the ruins, awed by the skill and artistry of the builders. The stones were cut and placed with such precision that after centuries of wind and weather, the walls still stood straight and true. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers along the carved symbols that seemed to dance in the late afternoon light. "It's also a lesson," Crow said, his voice serious. "These people built something meant to last forever. They thought their civilization would endure, that their children and their children's children would live in these houses and tend these fields. What happened to them? Nobody knows for certain. Drought, maybe disease, war, or perhaps they just chose to move on when this place no longer served their needs." Crow gestured toward the empty dwellings. "But their legacy remains. Not in the buildings, but in the knowledge that it's possible to create something beautiful and lasting, even in harsh country." Sarah Beth understood what he was trying to tell her. The fight they were undertaking wasn't just about stopping corruption or seeking justice for her father's death. It was about proving that ordinary people could stand against overwhelming odds and create something worth preserving. "The evidence we're carrying to Santa Fe," she said. "It's not just about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent. The families who haven't been targeted yet, the communities that haven't been destroyed." Crow's expression was fierce with determination. "It's about proving that the strong don't have the right to prey on the weak just because they can." They made camp in the ruins that night, building a small fire in what had once been a ceremonial chamber. The stone walls provided shelter from the wind, and the ancient carvings seemed to offer a kind of blessing on their mission. As they shared a simple meal of hardtack and dried meat, Sarah Beth found herself studying Crow's face in the firelight, memorizing the strong line of his jaw and the way his eyes seemed to hold depths of knowledge and experience far beyond his years. "Daniel," she said quietly, "when this is over, when we've delivered the evidence and seen justice done, what happens?" Then, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might reveal the secrets of the future. "I suppose that depends on what you want to happen." "I want ... Sarah Beth struggled to find words for feelings that were still taking shape in her heart. "I want to rebuild the homestead. Not exactly as it was, but as something new. Something better." "And you want to do that alone?" "No," she said, the word coming out more forcefully than she'd intended. No, I don't want to do it alone. Crow looked up from the fire, and in his storm-gray eyes she saw her own hopes and fears reflected. Back at her. Sarah Beth McKenna, are you asking me to stay? I'm asking you to consider it. To consider building something together. Not just rebuilding what was destroyed, but creating something entirely new. A life together, you mean. A partnership. A true partnership between equals who choose to stand together against whatever comes. Sarah Beth's heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. If that's something you'd want. Crow's answer came not in words, but in action. He reached across the fire and took her hand in his calloused fingers warm and strong. Against her palm. Sarah Beth, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I've been riding from place to place for 8 years, never staying long enough to put down roots or build anything lasting. But you make me want to stay. You make me want to build something that will endure. The ancient ruins around them seemed to approve, their stone walls holding the promise like a sacred trust. Tomorrow they would continue their journey. To Santa Fe, carrying evidence that could bring down a criminal conspiracy. But tonight, in the shelter of the Ancient Ones, 2 lost souls had found each other and discovered that home wasn't a place. It was a choice to stand together against. The world. Santa Fe rose from the high desert like a city of dreams, its adobe buildings glowing golden in the afternoon sun. After 4 days of hard riding through canyon country and mountain passes, the sight of civilization felt both welcoming and alien to Sarah Beth. She and Daniel had grown accustomed to the vast silences of the wilderness, to communication through glances and gestures, to the simple rhythms of travel and survival. Now they faced the complexities of human justice, territorial politics, and the delicate art of convincing powerful men to act against other powerful men. Marshall James Thompson's office occupied the ground floor of a sturdy stone building near the plaza, its heavy wooden door marked by a simple brass sign that announced United States Marshal, New Mexico Territory. Sarah Beth dismounted from Dusty, with legs stiff from days in the saddle, while Crow secured their precious cargo of evidence with the methodical care of a man who understood that everything depended on these papers reaching the right hands. Inside, Marshal Thompson proved to be a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with the kind of steady gaze that suggested he'd seen enough of human nature to surprise him rarely, but disappoint him often. His office was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized, with wanted posters covering one wall and territorial maps spread across a heavy oak desk. Mr. Crowfeather, Thompson said, rising to shake hands. Your telegram from Devil's Canyon reached me yesterday. You mentioned evidence of territorial land fraud involving federal officials. Evidence that goes far beyond simple fraud, Marshal. Crow replied, placing the oilcloth-wrapped documents on Thompson's desk. We're talking about murder, conspiracy, and systematic theft on a scale that threatens the stability of the entire territorial government. Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly, but he maintained his professional composure as Crow began laying out the evidence. Sarah Beth watched the Marshal's expression change from polite interest to growing concern to grim determination as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. This mining report from Miguel Santos, Thompson said, studying one of the key documents. It indicates gold deposits worth potentially millions of dollars, which explains why they were willing to kill to control the transportation routes, Sarah Beth interjected. My father's death, the forced foreclosures, even the attack on our homestead, all of it was designed to secure the corridor they needed to move gold from the mines to the railroad. Thompson spread out the map showing the pattern of land acquisitions, tracing the route with his finger. 23 properties acquired through questionable means over the past 18 months. If someone could prove coordination between these seemingly separate transactions. We can, Crow said, producing Cartwright's correspondence with his unknown associates. Bank records, payment schedules, even coded instructions for dealing with resistant property owners. The marshal read through the letters with growing amazement. They documented everything. Names, amounts, specific instructions for coercing compliance. He looked up at Sarah Beth with something approaching awe. "Miss McKenna, you realize what you've brought me here? This evidence could bring down half the territorial administration." "Good," Sarah Beth said firmly. "They murdered my father and tried to destroy my life. I want them to face justice. Justice, yes, but also consequences that extend far beyond personal satisfaction." Thompson stood and walked to a large safe in the corner of his office. "What I'm about to show you is information that could get us all killed if it falls into the wrong hands." From the safe, he withdrew a thick folder marked "Confidential Federal Investigation." Opening it revealed photographs, financial records, and correspondence that painted a picture of corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial and federal government. "We've been investigating this syndicate for over a year," Thompson explained. "But we've been missing the local connection, the mechanism they were using to acquire the properties they needed. Your evidence provides that missing link." Crow studied the federal documents with the eye of someone trained to read between the lines of official reports. "How high does this go?" "Territorial governor, at minimum. Possibly federal senators, railroad executives, mining company boards of directors." Thompson's voice was grim. "The kind of people who don't go to prison quietly." Sarah Beth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the office windows. "They'll try to stop you from using this evidence." "They'll try," Thompson agreed. "Which is why we're going to move fast and hard. Federal warrants will be issued within the hour. Coordinated arrests in 3 territories simultaneously." He paused, studying both of them carefully. "But I need you to understand the risks. These people have already killed to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to kill again." "Marshal," Sarah Beth said quietly, "they already tried to kill U.S. multiple times. At this point, the greatest risk would be doing nothing and allowing them to continue." Thompson nodded approvingly. Spoken like someone who understands the price of justice. He returned to his desk and began drafting arrest warrants with swift, decisive strokes. "I'll need you both to remain in Santa Fe until the trials conclude. Federal witness protection, comfortable accommodations, but no leaving the territory until this is finished." "How long?" Crow asked. 3 months minimum. Possibly 6, depending on how many of the conspirators decide to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Thompson looked up from his writing. "I realize that's a significant commitment, but your testimony will be essential to securing convictions." Sarah Beth exchanged glances with Crow, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his storm-gray eyes. 3 months away from the homestead, away from the life they'd been planning to build together. But also 3 months to let the wounds of the past heal completely, to plan their future without the shadow of conspiracy hanging over them. "We'll stay," she said simply. The next weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings, witness statements, and the controlled chaos of a federal investigation in full swing. Sarah Beth found herself testifying before grand juries, identifying evidence, and providing the kind of detailed local knowledge that transformed abstract legal theories into concrete proof of criminal activity. The trials themselves were a revelation in the power of truth properly presented. One by one, the members of the syndicate were brought before federal judges and confronted with evidence that demolished their carefully constructed facades of legitimacy. Silas Cartwright, faced with the choice between lengthy imprisonment and cooperation with federal prosecutors, chose to testify against his former associates in exchange for a reduced sentence. The territorial governor resigned in disgrace. 3. Federal senators found themselves under investigation. Railroad executives and mining company officials fled to jurisdictions beyond the reach of territorial law. And throughout it all, Sarah Beth watched justice unfold with the same methodical precision that her father had once used to build stone walls meant to last for generations. but it was the quiet moments between legal proceedings that mattered most. Long walks through Santa Fe's ancient streets with Crow, discussing plans for rebuilding the homestead. Evenings spent in the comfortable hotel suite provided by the marshal's office, reading letters from Jake Morrison about the progress of repairs to the barn and outbuildings. Conversations about the future that grew more detailed and concrete with each passing day. "I've been thinking about what you said," Crow told her one evening as they sat on the hotel's veranda, watching the sun set over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. "About creating something new rather than just rebuilding what was destroyed." Sarah Beth looked up from the letter she'd been writing to Mrs. Patterson, who had volunteered to oversee the homestead's reconstruction in their absence. "What kind of something new?" "A school," Crow said, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd found a purpose worth pursuing. "Not just for children, but for adults who want to learn to read, to understand their legal rights, to protect themselves from the kind of fraud that destroyed so many families." The idea hit Sarah Beth like a revelation. Teaching people to recognize the warning signs, to understand contracts before they sign them. Teaching them that they don't have to accept injustice just because it comes dressed in legal language. Crow's smile was warm with possibility. "Your scientific training, my knowledge of territorial law, both of our experience with standing up to corruption, we could help people protect themselves." Sarah Beth felt excitement building in her chest, like a fire catching wind. "We could use the homestead as the base. Plenty of room for classrooms, housing for students who travel from distant communities. And we could travel too, taking education to places where people can't come to us." Crow reached for her hand, his fingers warm and strong against hers. "A true partnership, serving something larger than ourselves." The final trial concluded on a crisp morning in early December, with the last of the major conspirators sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Marshal Thompson personally escorted Sarah Beth and Crow from the courthouse, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. "Justice served," he said simply. "And served well, thanks to your courage in bringing forward the evidence we needed." "What happens now?" Sarah Beth asked. "Are we free to go home?" "You're free to go anywhere you choose," Thompson replied. "Though, I hope you'll consider staying in the territory. People with your integrity and determination are exactly what this country needs as it grows and changes." The ride back to Willow Creek took 3 days, but it felt like a journey between worlds. Sarah Beth watched familiar landmarks appear on the horizon. The red rock formations that marked the approach to Devil's Canyon, the distant peaks that surrounded her valley, the weathered wooden sign that announced the town limits of her childhood. Home, but everything looked different somehow, as if the landscape itself had been transformed by the knowledge of what had transpired. The same mountains and mesas, the same dusty streets and adobe buildings, but all of it infused with new meaning and possibility. The homestead, when they finally reached it, was a revelation. Jake Morrison and a crew of volunteers had not only repaired the damage from the night attack, but had improved on the original structures. The barn was larger and more efficiently designed. The house had been expanded with additional rooms and modern conveniences. Even the workshop had been rebuilt with better lighting and more sophisticated equipment. "Welcome home," Morrison said, emerging from the barn with a grin that split his weathered face. "Though I suppose it's not quite the same home you left." Sarah Beth dismounted from Dusty and walked slowly through the transformed homestead, taking in the careful craftsmanship and thoughtful improvements. "Jake, this is this is incredible. How did you manage all this?" "Turns out a lot of folks in the territory owed your family debts of gratitude they never had a chance to repay," Morrison explained. "Word got around about what you'd done, about the corruption you'd exposed, and the lives you'd saved. People wanted to help." Crow appeared beside her, his arms sliding around her waist in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. "It's perfect. For what we have in mind. What you have in mind." Morrison asked, curious. Sarah Beth smiled, looking around at the expanded buildings and improved facilities. We're going to start a school, Jake. A place where people can learn to protect themselves from the kind of predators who almost destroyed our community. Morrison's grin widened. Well, I'll be damned. A school for justice, you might say. A school for truth, Crow corrected gently. Justice flows naturally from truth, once people have the tools to recognize it. As the sun set over the valley, that had been home to 3 generations of McKennas, Sarah Beth stood with her arm around the man who had saved her life in every way that mattered. The homestead spread around them like a promise made manifest, ready to serve not just as their home, but as a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that ordinary people could stand against corruption and win. The debt that had once threatened to destroy her was long paid. But the real payment, she realized, had never been measured in silver coins. It had been measured in courage discovered, in love found, and in the knowledge that some things, truth, justice, and the bonds between kindred spirits were worth any price. The lame horse that had once represented everything broken in her life now grazed contentedly in the pasture, his limp barely noticeable as he moved with the confidence of an animal who knew he was home. And beside him, Thunder stood sentinel, the magnificent stallion that had carried them through danger to safety, from despair to hope, from solitude to partnership. Sarah Beth McKenna had begun this journey with nothing but a lame horse and her father's debt. She was ending it with a home, a husband, a mission, and the unshakable knowledge that sometimes the most valuable payments were made not in silver, but in the courage to stand for what was right. In the distance, the lights of Willow Creek twinkled like earthbound stars, and the future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story, full of possibility and promise.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.